So where we start off in this project is from the notion that moral courage behavior as a social phenomenon is exceptional. It's something that we observe rarely, and that for this reason it might serve to identify exceptional people, morally exceptional people. And that's really the main question that drove our research. So we looked at psychological processes that are connected to morally courageous behavior, and asked whether it's possible to predict inter-individual differences in these processes from relatively stable characteristics of people. I would like to start off with speaking about a working definition that we use to limit the use of the term moral courage. And we speak about moral courage behavior when initially uninvolved observers witness somebody else's violation of their moral principles, and then those initially uninvolved observers turn to intervene to stop or redress that violation despite the risk of substantial own cost and the lack of personal incentives. And here we have pictures of quite famous people for whom this working definition fits. And even though each of those cases might be controversial, I think also for each of those cases there's a substantial group of people that consider them moral exemplars.
And besides these more prominent examples, there are also situations that are more every kind situations, like theft or interventions against, for example, uncivil behavior. And empirically, it's really proven that interventions against such situations are rare. So the intervention rates range between 1% and 30%, with the exception of intervention against sexual harassment. So, and I also have to add that based on an ambulatory assessment study we conducted across a time span of 2 weeks, we know that people are frequently encountered with norm violation in their daily lives, but still the rates of intervention are extremely low. And obviously there seem to be psychological barriers a person has to take. So in order to engage in morally courageous behavior, people have to successfully pass different distinct psychological stages. And we try to summarize this in an integrated process model that has been inspired by different models, theoretical models we find from the field of moral justice and bystander intervention. And on the first step, in order to intervene, a person has to detect the situation. So a person has to see or hear situational cues that might be related to this norm violation. Then on the second step, the situation has to be interpreted as a norm violation. So the person or the bystander has to perceive it as severe, as immoral, in order to be motivated to intervene. And then emotional reactions are directly interlinked with these interpretations or evaluations of the situation. And first, two emotions we can think about as anger and guilt that are typically related to the witnessing of norm violation. However, also other emotions like, for example, anxiety, irritation, empathy, or even anticipated pride can influence our behavior. Then we assume that reappraisal processes can occur, especially in situations when there's a low pressure to act, when people can think about the situation. This involves that a person, for example, weighs costs and benefits of intervention, and that he or she reattributes, for example, the causes of the situation. And this might, again, affect how this person interprets the situations and how they emotionally react. And then at the first step, the motivation is important. So how important is it for the person to intervene? And also it raises the question if there are, for example, conflicting aims or conflicting motives in a situation to act. We did not aim to test this model or in whole. Rather, we used to identify candidates of personality variables that should shape those different steps or each step separately or interactively.
Yeah, so this is really taking these process ideas as heuristic or as a framework to derive hypotheses about which dispositional variables could be relevant in predicting morally courageous behavior. And so what we did is try to come up from the literature with variables that we can operationalize that should more or less specifically impact the processes at each stage. And here we will only talk about what can be considered specifically moral dispositions. So we looked at more different kinds of dispositions, and here we'll also talk about constructs that we use self-report measures for. So first of all, the degree to which people tend to be attentive to moral issues might impact on whether they detect a situation as a moral violation at all. Moral foundations or the endorsement of different moral foundations could be relevant to the degree that people interpret the situation as being severe or immoral, and so could the sensitivity to injustice. And sensitivity to injustice has also an emotional component, so reactivity to injustices. So it's also plausible to hypothesize that this variable should predict whether people react, or to which degree people react with negative emotions to others' violations. And on the reappraisal side, moral disengagement is a concept that hypothesizes that people to different degrees tend to employ psychological mechanisms to avoid feeling guilty and still not be forced to stick to their own standards. So more disengagement might lead to reappraisals of the situation as less severe and less immoral. And finally, on this motivation step, the concept of moral identity entails that people that hold morality as central to their identity should be motivated to act accordingly in order to be consistent. So based on these ideas, we hypothesized that these constructs should help to predict intervention behavior against others' violations. And based on these ideas, we conducted 2 studies, and today we will mainly talk about the second study for time reasons, but also because here we are further on with data analysis. So the first study, what we call about morally courageous exemplars, we invited award winners in Germany, so people who had been awarded prizes for morally courageous behavior in the past, to participate in our study. And in addition, we had a self-nomination call through media and social media to invite people who would say themselves that they had been morally courageous in the past. And we had a first stage where people described the situation in which they had observed another person's moral violation, and then describe how they reacted. And we coded these open-ended answers with regard to our criteria of moral courage related to our working definition, and then invited back people who fit in that definition to a second time of assessment where a personality battery was applied. And we also have a matched control group of people who report not to have intervened against others' violations in the past. So that's the first data set that we collected and that we can use to test our hypothesis. And the second study that we want to talk about in more detail, we enacted a norm violation in the laboratory and observed how people reacted. So people were invited under a cover story to a study, to the lab, and in this situation an embezzlement was, they were confronted with an embezzlement, and Anna will show you more in detail how that worked. And we had observer ratings and video codings of people's behavior. And plus, in this situation, we were able to take so-called process measures. So we took measures of people's immediate responses to that situation, all under the cover story. So we had physiological measurement, heart rate. We had what we call online self-report emotional experience. So repeatedly, as part of the cover story, people indicated how they felt in those moments. But we also have video codings of the emotional expressions, and we have retrospectively, so after people were debriefed, we have a self-report of how they interpreted the situation and how they embraced the situation.
So to give you a short overview of our sample, we recruited 145 non-psychology students, and as Anna told, we had 2 measurement occasions. So on the first measurement occasion, we assessed personality dispositions online or in a laboratory, and then approximately 1 or 2 weeks later, we invited them to join us in the laboratory, and then they observed this staged embezzlement. And let's have a look at the laboratory setting in detail. It is divided into different phases, and in the first phase, the subject and another participant who was in real and confederate arrived, and they were instructed by 2 experimenters. They were informed about the procedure of the study and also about, or they received the informed consent for the videotapes. They received a written description of this laboratory situation, and they were asked how they perceived the situation, and they indeed perceived it as really severe, immoral. They reported that they would experience anger towards the behavior of the 2 experimenters. They perceived it as moderately difficult and not really risky. And what might be the main interesting point is that in this case, the self-reported intervention rate was about 59%. And just again, to give you an overview of our assessment, and I told you already something about it, we have video recordings for nearly the whole phase. Then to assess the intervention, we asked our actors to rate if the participants intervened or not. As you know, we have the heart rate as physiological measure. Then we have the online self-report for emotions and the baseline heart rate assessment. And again, and as I told you, after the briefing, we also wanted to know when the moment was when they detected the situation, how they interpreted the situation, and what their reason was, why they acted like they did. So, and Anna is now presenting our results.
Yeah, so we finished data assessments in February this year, and now we have a phase of heavy coding of the videos. So all the results are still preliminary, and we're not able to present all the results from the video codings yet. But maybe some first, and we think, really interesting findings. So first of all, you might ask, so was this setup credible? Of course, with the deception study, the question is, did people actually experience it as realistic? And as Anna said, one suspicion check that we had was part of the cover story, where people got asked after the learning task whether what they thought the study was about. And we coded their open-ended answers, and we coded them as no, meaning no suspicion. So for example, some people wrote, the study was about how blog posts are processed, so they read blog posts, and that was part of the learning task. Then there were answers where we thought it was unclear, which would be, for example, effects of situations on emotion and learning. That's related to the cover story, but it could also relate to the embezzlement. And some people really mentioned the fraud or the embezzlement. And this was 14 people whose data we excluded from the analysis. And just on the plane, I looked at more open-ended answers that people gave after the debriefing to have a more conservative way to determine whether people had doubts. And looking at what people said, why they acted as they acted, there were 40 people who said, well, I had doubts about the situation, and that was why I acted the way I acted. But the good thing is that all the results that we present now remain the same even if we exclude all those people. So that was kind of reassuring. And eventually we will also have the video codings, which we code for signs of disbelief. How did people interpret the situation? Afterwards, we asked them, when did you think the experimenters embezzled money? And we see that most of them thought that during the planning or during the execution, which was putting the money into the pocket. But there were some people that said, well, I never detected that. Even though it was like happening right there. How severe would you find this behavior happening in reality? This really matches the pre-test, so most people thought it would be very severe, and only very few people thought, well, I don't care about this. And also what's interesting, looking at risk, would you think there's any risk related to intervention? And 57% said yes. And we also had open-ended questions regarding which kind of risk they would perceive, and they were really detailed in what they feared could have happened to them if they had intervened. What about the emotional reaction? So remember, after the embezzlement occurs, they go to the computers and before they start the learning task, they are asked about their emotions again. That's the red bars, that's the baseline before anything happens. And then after the learning task, that's the green bar. And we only used adjectives, so they only rated adjectives. And this is composed of 3 adjectives, and you see that there is some anger reaction in the mean, but very low, and much lower than what people thought in reaction to the descriptions. There's also some reaction on the guilt items, guilt and shame. Anxiety goes up a little bit, but that's not significant, and how empathetic people feel just stays the same. So what about intervention rates? We're of course curious about this. So a large majority did not do anything. And then we coded, that's the ratings of the 2 experimenters, the confederate and the project leader for the different phases. And we coded 1 if they gave a comment or a question that didn't have to be related to the fraud. We coded 2 if they labeled the experimenter's behavior as wrong and said, this is not okay what you're doing, for example, and 3 if they said, stop this, anyway. And so it was just above 25% of people who did anything at all. And if we exclude all those that mentioned afterwards that they had some doubts, the percentages stay roughly the same. So it's 30% who interviewed. All right. So our major question was, is it possible to predict this behavior? And the response is no. We had a large assessment battery from all the variables that we assessed. there were only very few that had bivariate correlations with the behavior. But looking at the process measures, we find significant correlations, especially anger reactions, so how strong anger goes up after the embezzlement is related to whether people intervene. And we find correlations of dispositional variables with the emotional reactions. So in that sense, they're indirect. Indirectly, some dispositional measures are linked. So I'll skip this. And just very briefly, what we find is that in particular, the sensitivity to observe injustice is predictive of how much anger people experience in that situation. And the moral disposition predicts how severely people perceive the situation. And indirectly, through severity and anger reaction, these two variables are linked to intervention behavior. Okay, so time's up, but I ignore that and come to the conclusion.
but it's really the last slide.
I think that's wrong.
Yeah? Oh, yeah, very courageous. Very risky. I mean, of course, it's an urgent question. Why is it not possible? Why are there no bivariate correlations with the intervention behavior? And that might be methodologically or statistical, but it seems that it's important to look at the psychological processes and to understand the inter-individual differences in psychological processes in order to understand intervention behavior. So I think in particularly the process measures that we took are telling, and we find systematic inter-individual differences in these processes, and these differences are linked to behavior. And the inter-individual differences in the processes can be predicted by relatively stable characteristics. So I think that's a conclusion that we can draw. And plus, I mean, stunningly, it's those dispositions that we hypothesized to be linked to those processes that then actually predict those. Yeah, I think that should be it. Skip all this. As I said, large teams of people were involved. This is really collaborative effort. And we thank all those people and thank the Beacon Project very much.
Back on slides 4 and 5, you give a sort of sequence of how bystanders intervene. But it's kind of it's a common occurrence that when people exercise altruistic behaviors, pull people out of burning buildings, that kind of thing, and they're interviewed afterwards and they ask, why did you do this? They don't report this sequence. They say, well, they were in trouble. And they sort of just give you the facts of the matter. They don't run through a sequence in your mind. But it seems like people who are exemplarily altruistic or morally courageous in this don't go through that sequence in any way. Do you have a comment on that phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And one hypothesis is actually that when people perceive the situation as a moral violation, we believe they are likely to react emotionally and then skip all kinds of risk considerations. This is not strong evidence for that. We can only show that emotions are relevant for predicting intervention. Interestingly though, when we look at the open-ended comments that people give, especially among those that did not intervene, they mention all these different stages. So, they mention different ones where they say, I was afraid it was risky, I didn't know what to do, I wasn't sure about the situation. So it kind of speaks to what you say. So potentially these are the barriers, and those people that overcome them might just skip them.
There is empirical evidence that the later stages, for example, the reappraisal processes, this weighing of costs and benefits, that this might be skipped, that people not rationally weigh their costs. And I think that this is especially important for moral courage.
Thank you.
So I do have quite a large list of people who have questions, so if you would keep your question short, I would appreciate it. Alan.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. These studies look really, really interesting. Actually, my question is actually about how moral courage was set up for the purposes of the study. In particular, I was wondering about the motivation for making it part of moral courage that it's a kind of uninvolved observer. I was kind of thinking of, so kind of standard cases of moral courage might be people that kind of help and stand up for those who are being persecuted or discriminated against. But it also seems possible to demonstrate moral courage if you yourself are the target of the persecution or the discrimination. But it doesn't appear as if you're an uninvolved observer.
Yeah.
So I was wondering what the motivation was for setting a moral courage as that is demonstrated by uninvolved observers rather than just anyone who's aware of the situation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this is we explicitly label it as a working definition, so we're not saying it's the best definition. And we're particularly struggling exactly with this point. So we started off with this restricted definition, and the idea about that was that we might be on safer grounds making assumption about the moral motivation behind the behavior, whereas direct victims might have more self-related concerns that drive their behavior. But of course, I mean, there could be all kinds of other motivations also driving the behavior of uninvolved bystanders. So we're kind of tending to extending the working definition.
But interestingly, what has been shown is that moral courage is more accepted by others if the bystander or the people that intervenes is not in the group of the victims. So it really is behavior for others.
That's interesting. Thanks.
Thank you for your paper. I have a question about other possible characteristics that you might be able to test to see whether they're correlated with the tendency to be. And I'm thinking, I know some people who in that study might feel a little angry, know that investment is wrong, but go along with it just out of a desire not to offend the other person or blame them, right?
Yeah.
And then other people would be angry, and they wouldn't care that the person's going to be offended when they're called out. Like my mom. Man, she wouldn't be. So, would there be a way to put some of these sort of social characteristics about how much we care what others think about us, to test to see if those are correlated?
Yeah, we did. For example, we also assessed agreeableness because we thought that agreeableness would be a predictor that negatively is related to morally courageous behavior.
I missed the key word.
Agreeableness.
Agreeable.
Yeah.
And also social anxiety, we assess that. I mean, it's a huge battery, so we could only talk about small parts.
Yeah.
So maybe your idea would be captured with agreeableness best, which wasn't correlated. But we also looked at, for example, self-efficacy, so whether people think they have the skills to deal with difficult situations, and that was also not linked to behavior.
But the basic idea really was that, similar to the previous talk, that people that would be able to pass all these psychological barriers, they should have a network or profile of different personality dispositions that make this possible. So in your example, maybe they are persons that care about what is happening here, and they are even angry, but they are not that much motivated to do anything.
Yeah. So in the Exemplar study, we are planning to do more interactional analysis and looking at patterns of characteristics among people that are awarded for more courageous behavior.
Welcome. Thank you very much. So I should first just qualify, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a psychologist. But one thing that did occur to me is I thought of Milgram's obedience experiments. And I was thinking that maybe if it's the experimenters that are engaged in this embezzlement, there could just be like a sort of disposition to be submissive to the authorities going on, a similar phenomenon. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting that the intervention rates are quite similar across all these studies, and in particular also with the Milgram studies. And it's very likely that I mean, this is a compliance situation, and
But what speaks against this is that there are also theft studies that have a really other scenario where the theft is more an equal to the witnesses, and still the intervention rates are pretty similar. So it's always around these 30% or lower than 30%. So I think that it might play a role if there's, for example, a difference in status between the perpetrator and the victims, but it seems not to be that important in these studies.
Thank you so much. Great. I have a question about the process model. Looked like the stage 1 was detection and the stage 2 is interpretation. That's correct. I'm not quite sure why those two are different and what exactly do you mean by detection? So originally I said well, the detect stuff like embezzlement happening, but that seems already like on the interpretation stage, right? It's like construing the situation as embezzlement. So what exactly do you mean by detection?
yeah, I mean, in this situation, it's quite likely that people detect that something's going on. It's actually like they're talking kind of vigilance, that there's some change in the environment which doesn't have to be morally relevant.
But in general, I totally agree that it's not easy to disentangle both, but the detection more captures really an orientation towards the cue of the situation, like that I see or hear something that is other than the normal thing I would expect, and then in a second step there's an evaluation of the situation that I really label it. I label it as oh, that is wrong. What is happening here?
You might have done this, but you said people wrote about whether or not they were aware of potential costs intervening. And you said something quite detailed. Did you look at whether that was related to whether they intervened?
Did you?
Not yet. I think. Not yet.
Not yet.
I only know from other studies, for example by Fisher and colleagues, that interestingly situations that would be perceived objectively as rather not that costly, or not those situations or conditions under which people really intervene the most.
See if I have something.
I was going to ask whether, so I thought there was this idea that by identifying people who intervene and then studying their character, we might learn something about the character that's morally exceptional, like those that intervene are going to be more morally exceptional. And I was going to, so my question is about whether we have to be cautious about that. And I was thinking, well, look, you might have someone who is just like hyperactively construes all kinds of situations as violating norms. And so they just like tend to intervene all the time. They just think everyone's like doing wrong stuff all the time. and so they might have they might be more likely to intervene, but we would want to be cautious about thinking, oh, that's the morally exceptional person. And do you think we need to be cautious in that way?
Yeah, I totally agree that we should be. And I think that one problem is that we are still a bit of struggling with the theoretical stages that come before the intervention behavior, but there's only few really discussing what intervention or what moral courage means. And one point is that there might be a kind of intervention that is too strong to be labeled as moral courageous, because as an example, to beat the perpetrator would not anymore be labeled moral courage. And the motivation behind that might be that a person is really hostile and thinking that everyone is my enemy, I have to protect myself and others. But it's not easy to really find the cutoff point where to say, okay, in this area it's still more courage and this is too much to be identified, and we are not yet at the point where we would say, okay, if there's a specific pattern of personality that divides these normally morally courageous persons from that are more in the psychopathic area of intervening.
Final questions?
I love what you're doing, and I actually think some of your results echo some of the work on whistleblowing. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
your trouble finding dispositional predictors is very consistent with that literature. So I think you're going to hit on something that enlightens that question. But this isn't that question. Moral courage. How do you conceive of that as different from courage? And is there a special tone to moral courage that makes it different from just courage? And if so, what is it? I mean, would a generally courageous person look different in your experiments than a morally courageous person?
Well, we heard a great talk this morning
Oh, I'm
about
sorry.
exactly that question. So I refer to that paper, which is, if I got it right, one of the basic statements was that courage is not moral per se,
Right.
but it depends on the motivation that is facilitated through courage. And that's kind of what that's kind of, if I got that one right, that's kind of how we try to set it up. And on an empirical level, for example, we could look at social anxiety, right, which would be like maybe a proxy to more general not being courageous in social situations. And interestingly, that didn't correlate, and if anything, the tendency went in the wrong direction, with social anxious people being more likely to be among those that intervene.
Although, I mean, I almost think that courage is, one version of courage or moral courage is when you're anxious and yet you act, right? That you're able to sort of overcome, again, I don't want to do this, I don't want to, I'm gonna do it. And that's what courage, that's a really deep notion.
Yeah, yeah.
So they'd be socially anxious, but they still do.
Yeah. So I mean, our general idea is that we would always expect an interaction in this situation.
Yeah.
Like you have to care about the situation at all before anything else becomes relevant. Like before your level of anxiety becomes relevant.
Next time, speakers.